consequential bilateral relationship, and that's our relationship with China. I'm Senator Ed Markey. I am the chair of the East Asia Subcommittee on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. That's the Senate Foreign Relations Committee subcommittee that has jurisdiction over China. And from that seat, you know, I have an excellent perch to see these issues as they are unfolding. And I just want to stop here for a second and just thank Fletcher students who are participating today, because when I ran for Congress for the first time many years ago, there were 50 Fletcher students who volunteered in my campaign out of Medford in order to have, by the way, not only a lot of people ringing doorbells, but doing the polling for me and writing all of my foreign policy papers as well. And so many of them have gone on to do just such great work. So I thank all of them and all of you for all of the work that they did. And it's great to be here with all of you, a whole new group of ambassadors to the world from the United States. Although I know there are many who come from other countries who will be ambassadors from those countries back to the United States as well. So everyone here knows that I have been working on this question of climate change for years. The planet is running a fever. There are no emergency rooms for sick planets. The climate crisis is a national security, health, economic, and moral issue. The question that we have to deal with is whether or not we are going to take the action which is necessary. I've been working on all these issues throughout my career, increasing fuel economy standards. That's a law I was able to get passed in 2007 that Ronald Reagan rolled back. Increasing the efficiency of appliances, which we use in the United States. That's another standard that Donald Trump had his Department of Energy sit on their hands. And the only comprehensive climate bill to ever pass a chamber of Congress. In 2009, by 219 to 212, my bill passed to reduce greenhouse gases by 80% by the year 2050. And so what I decided to do is kind of change my approach and realize that we needed to inject some more political energy into the issue. So I introduced with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez the Green New Deal in February of 2019, which she and I just reintroduced a couple of weeks ago on the US Capitol grounds. And that resolution has become a revolution in mobilizing all sectors of our society, especially young people, to rise up, get involved, protect our planet and its people now and for generations to come. So ultimately, the Green New Deal is really about intersectionality of environmental justice, healthcare justice, racial justice. And we know who has been disproportionately impacted. It's the poorest people in the United States. It's the poorest people around the planet. And we have an opportunity right now to do something about it. It's a driver of recurring droughts, food insecurity, migration, destructive weather systems, health problems, and resource competition. Ignoring science, ignoring Mother Nature, and avoiding bold action on this issue is a losing strategy for all of humanity and poses a national security risk for the United States around the world, but for too many countries around the world as well. So the United States, as we know, can't solve this climate crisis alone. The United States and China are the two largest contributors of climate pollution, with China now responsible for more than a quarter of global emissions each year alone, but remembering that so much of the CO2 up in the atmosphere is red, white, and blue. Much of the CO2 that was emitted from the boat coming over from Ireland that my grandmother and grandfather were on is still up there in the atmosphere. It's cumulative. So the United States and China have to solve this problem. We have to agree. And because we're the two wealthiest countries in the world by GDP, because we're two of the most innovative countries, we have a chance to partner to do something big historically for the planet. And while we have very serious policy disagreements, we are not in a Cold War with China. We have to continue to oppose China and its government's horrific human rights abuses, authoritarianism, and aggressive meddling in the Indo-Pacific region. But we also have to embrace the reality that a climate change policy that doesn't include China is no policy at all. Our very existence depends on this global challenge and cooperation between our countries. And together, the United States and China can and should lead the international green revolution that we so urgently need to meaningfully combat climate change. We have just an incredible, world-class, outstanding group of speakers here tonight with deep expertise on these issues. First, I'd like to thank Rachel Kite, the Dean of the Fletcher School and Professor of Practice, for her important contributions in helping us organize this event and for participating tonight. Prior to assuming her role as the first woman dean of the Fletcher School, Rachel Kite served as special representative of the UN Secretary General and Chief Executive Officer of Sustainable Energy for All. Also joining us from Fletcher is Dr. Kelly Sims Gallagher, who serves as academic dean and a professor of energy and environmental policy. She also directs the Climate Policy Lab and the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy at Fletcher. And finally, Dr. Yifei Li is joining us from Shanghai, China, where he is an assistant professor of environmental studies at the New York University Shanghai campus. Dr. Li's research focuses on both the broad implications of Chinese environmental governance for state-society relations, marginalized populations, and global ecological sustainability, as well as the processes involved in China's state interventions into the environmental realm. So I'm just so appreciative that these incredible world-renowned experts have joined us tonight, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. But I'll just add, we also have some fantastic students from Fletcher, and they will be weighing in with some of their questions that they have a great interest in, and our experts will be asked to answer. And to the students, I say, whether you're studying business, health, or security, the battle to arrest the climate crisis is likely to shape your career, your future, as you well know. I don't need to tell you that. The decisions we make today will impact our tomorrow. We are counting on you to help save what Carl Sagan called the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. And it's our job to save it. So let me begin then. Let me just start us off. And I want to ask you, Dean Kite, why is it so important that the United States engages with China on the climate crisis?
Well, thank you very much, Senator. It's a real pleasure to have you with us at Fletcher, even if we're on Zoom. And thank you for your leadership, and thank you for all you're going to do now as chair of this very important Senate committee. The relationship is important both for the performance of both the United States and the Chinese economies and societies in what has now been framed as a race to net zero emissions. So the idea that the ambition we need in order to curb climate emissions is that we should be at net zero around mid-century, which means that by 2030, we really have to have had a sizable, made a sizable dent in the emissions profile of both countries as well as the rest of the world. So that relationship, and Dr. Gallagher knows much more about the intricacies of that, having negotiated that previously under the Obama administration, but that relationship is key for the performance of both countries that are inextricably linked in terms of trade and finance, and in terms of the technologies that will provide us with a pathway to prosperity. But that relationship is also critical because it is the lion's share of the global economy. And if you add the European Union into that, that's more than 60% of global GDP. And so those three blocks and how they interrelate with each other and how they cooperate in the rest of the world will really be a key factor in whether other countries can succeed as well. And as you've pointed out, we only have one planet. So this isn't a race where one country can succeed and another can fail. It's a race where we've all got to cross the finish line more or less at the same time, but we've certainly all got to cross the finish line. So the way in which China and the United States cooperate on climate in terms of how they think about technologies, access to technologies, the way that they instruct the financial sectors in their countries to understand the risk from climate change, the standards that are set, the way in which they operate with their own public finance overseas, as well as how their own private sectors invest overseas, that direction of travel and that being aligned between China and the United States will be really important to help the global trading system, the global economic governance system, all be able to support developing countries, middle-income countries, as well as then the United States economy and the Chinese economy. It's a difficult concept to sell. The idea that, that we can produce jobs and prosperity at home by cooperating with a country with whom we have large disagreements, as you've said. But there is a need for a sort of radical collaboration between major powers. And at the heart of that lies the relationship between the United States and China.
So thank you, Dean. So Dr. Li, just following up on what Dean Kite just said, how does the Chinese government weigh climate change in their domestic and foreign policy? And what motivation does China have to cooperate with the United States on this front? Why don't they just go it alone?
Thank you, Senator. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you for that question. I think one of the things that we have to understand in China's calculus about climate partnership is this notion of ecological civilization, which for those of you who don't know, has already been enshrined into the Chinese Constitution and the Constitution of the Chinese Communist Party. A lot of people tend to just dismiss the notion as mere propaganda. And I don't disagree with the fact that there is an element of propaganda in it, but we also have to understand that when the Chinese state elevates this notion of ecological civilization to such a high level, it has a lot of historical and ideological baggage that we have to unpack. Now, for one, the Chinese Communist Party has been projecting itself to its own people as a great force of civilizational revival. They constantly say that they want to, quote unquote, rejuvenate the Chinese nation. Now, historically, that whole idea hasn't been very clearly articulated until this emergence of the ecological civilization. They seem to be suggesting that the Communist Party isn't just reviving China back to any random kind of civilizational leadership, but very specific kind, an ecological kind of civilizational leadership for the whole world. And we have to understand that they're saying that this is a kind of leadership that hasn't been attempted before in human history. So in many ways, when they've elevated environmental protection in general and climate change in particular to such a high level of national strategy, it becomes not only a survival matter for the Chinese Communist Party, but really it embodies a whole lot of ambitions and aspirations on the part of the Chinese government to such a point that environmental protection is really becoming the very core of the Communist Party's developmental strategy moving forward. So in that sense, I think the room for collaboration, the room for partnership is obviously there. The real question is how to get to some concrete action.
Okay, so before we discuss in detail what cooperation should look like, I'd like you all to give us an idea of what our climate efforts currently look like, so we can get a baseline that we're looking at. So at the recent Leaders Climate Summit, President Biden announced that the United States will cut greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% relative to 2005 levels in less than a decade. And last year, China announced its intention to reach peak emissions by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. So, Dean Kite, what does the world look like in 2050 if the US and China continue to independently pursue the climate initiatives they're currently laying out?
Well, I think what we saw at the Leaders Summit that President Biden convened was, first of all, very importantly, the United States joining formally with its own domestic commitment to 52%, the sort of journey that the world is on. And you saw the result of energetic US diplomacy in other countries coming early in a year of climate diplomacy, because we're working up towards the climate talks in Glasgow in November. You saw countries coming perhaps earlier than they would have done otherwise, with a tightening of their commitments. And so as a result of the US diplomacy, what we see now is a tightened commitment by Japan, a tightened commitment by Korea, although still a problem in that Japan will continue to finance coal overseas. China, in advance of that summit, clarified, and I think the mood music was very positive, but we still wait to see for some definition from China between now and maybe the G7 or the G20 meeting. There's an important G20 finance meeting that will come in July, but we wait to see for some more definition of peaking of coal and some industrial and sectoral standards or commitments for how different parts of the Chinese economy will ratchet up their achievements. So what the US has done is sort of pushed everybody along this race a little bit faster because they are now in it. So there are things that still need to be tidied up. And we do face a situation that in November, when every country has made their commitment, we will still not be on track for where we need to be. And so there's a question then of continuing to leapfrog forward. So we have global talks in November, but then can the US-Chinese relationship continue to move ourselves forward? The Chinese have a reputation for under-promising and over-delivering. And frankly, we need the Biden administration to also cement that level of performance within the US economy. If they're both able to stay on that trajectory, it pulls everybody else along. European Union has a climate law that commits the European Union to a 55% cut in emissions by 2030. But there's reason to believe that that could be superseded as well. And we just look at what happened this week in Germany, where Germany has ratcheted up its commitment in response to a lawsuit filed by people that said that the German law did not protect them from the impacts of climate change. That will mean that Germany will probably have to speed up its exit from coal by probably around 8 years. And so I think this ratcheting process, the continued ambition level that's expressed by governments is very much a journey, but with the US and China at the heart of it, working out underneath their major targets how they will actually achieve it, this can be an engine that drives everybody else forward, which is why it's so important that the cooperation on climate continues despite the difficulties in the relationship in other areas of technology, human rights, security, etc.
Could I ask you, Dean, just to follow up, you said that there's a history of China under-promising and over-delivering. Can you give us an example of that?
Well, I think the Chinese are very reluctant to make commitments in a way in which they don't know how they will deliver on it. And so, many other countries have a tendency to say, yes, okay, we'll sign up. And then there's a furious process of working out, well, how would we actually deliver on that? I think the Chinese system is different. And the hard-fought discussions and the hard-fought arguments over exactly how a target is to be achieved often happen before the announcement is made. And so that then allows for overperformance, because as the data improves and as analysis improves, so it might be possible to even overshoot the target. Now, at the moment, of course, we're watching the Chinese economy rebound from the downturn in emissions that resulted in the early stages of the pandemic, China has come back with a vengeance. And in fact, its emissions have grown. And so we're at a very delicate point where some of the indications are that the Chinese would be able to pull forward in time some of their targets and some of their peaking. But at the moment, there is an extraordinary momentum in the Chinese emissions. And so we hope that they can continue to set targets and then perhaps overachieve them in the time in which they, in the time span that they've set for themselves.
If I could just jump in, one very concrete example is their carbon intensity target, which they over-delivered on for 2020. And they've actually ratcheted up or tightened the carbon intensity target for 2025 in the context of their new 14th five-year plan.
Yeah, so a lot of technological breakthroughs in China. They're the largest producer of solar panels, largest producer of wind turbines in the world. So they see this as a great economic opportunity. They want to do the same thing in all electric vehicles. They want to be dominant. So it's a great economic opportunity for them, especially if the United States for 4 years under Donald Trump just sits on the sidelines. They're saying, thank you so much for giving us this great lead that we're enjoying right now. And let me ask you this, Dean Gallagher, oftentimes we fail to appreciate how the climate crisis is already affecting communities around the world. The Indo-Pacific in particular is one of the most vulnerable regions to climate-related disasters. With that in mind, I actually recently added a provision to the Strategic Competition Act just 2 weeks ago that passed out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that calls on the United States to create a robust interagency climate resiliency and adaptation strategy for the region. And that will be an important step for safeguarding the vulnerable region. But we have to think even bigger and bolder to protect the global community. So, Dr. Gallagher, what should the United States and China's goals be as we seek to ensure that the most dangerous climate impacts are avoided?
Well, the first thing I would say is that long-term success depends on near-term action. So while we are, excited about all of these, net zero goals by mid-century, whether it's 2050 or 2060, we don't have a prayer of achieving those goals without near-term action. And I think the most important focus in the next year for both the United States and China needs to be the concrete policy action plan that gets the two countries on track to achieve their targets. In China, we just had their, release of their recent 14th five-year plan. I think there's a lot of room for more specificity. Can they have sectoral targets? Are they going to be restricting coal? Are they going to be capping coal? A lot of detail remains to be clarified. Are they going to tighten up their emissions trading system? And in the United States, we need to know, can Congress pass a bill? Can Congress pass the infrastructure bill? Can we get a clean energy standard? Can we implement the regulations where the Biden administration already has regulatory authority? These things are so important so that the domestic policy pathways must be clarified and acted upon. And then the second most important thing would be to really focus on the overseas agenda, as you just mentioned, because I think mainstreaming climate considerations into all of our overseas development finance and all of our development aid is crucial, not just in the United States, but also in China. China needs to work on greening its BRI, and the United States needs to work on showing up and being able to have something on offer. And I think one really important potential area for cooperation is partnering in some of these third-party countries. And we need to really focus on role modeling how to do low carbon economic development. These developing countries have really, understandable development aspirations. They want to grow, but we can't afford to have a big new wave of emissions from many of these rapidly growing emerging economies, like you mentioned in the ASEAN region. They need to grow in a low carbon and resilient fashion.
Yeah, well, I'm also on the infrastructure committee, and I'm the chair of the climate and clean air subcommittee on the environment and infrastructure committee. So out of that committee has to come the commitment that President Biden made. And I know one thing, you can't preach temperance from a bar stool. You can't tell the rest of the world, stop doing something,
Exactly.
and you continue to do it yourself. And a vision without funding is an hallucination. So we have to demonstrate that we can pass a big infrastructure bill, a green infrastructure bill, so that on wind and solar, all electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, battery storage technologies, new transmission technologies, new agricultural policies, that we're serious. Otherwise, we can expect the rest of the world to not take us as seriously as they would, as we would like them to. But it's going to be actions, not words, that make the difference. So, how do we work? Dean Kite mentioned this. How do we do this in concert with the EU and the UK and Japan and other partners and allies? So she raised that issue. Could you follow up a little bit in terms of how all of them have to be included as well?
Well, I think there's an important agenda, and Dean Kite referenced the G7 and the G20, both of which will be taking place this summer. There's a pretty important agenda there where we can stop funding, the high carbon and climate risky or lack of resilient, development. So it's time to start restricting coal in overseas development finance. It's long past time for all countries to be doing that. And then I think just as important is the positive development agenda, which is really creating a new offering for infrastructure-led development. What do developing countries want to do? They want to develop, and most of them look at the China development model, which they see as an infrastructure-led economic development model. And I think the United States has this really important opportunity, as you're referencing, to showcase a low carbon infrastructure-led development model, right? We want to spur jobs and economic growth through low carbon infrastructure. And if we can show that that works, the demonstration effect will be very powerful around the world.
I agree with you 100%. So let's turn to one of your fabulous Fletcher students, Brian Larson, who also happens to be one of my former congressional interns. So Brian, can you pose your question, please?
Sure. Thank you, Senator Markey. I appreciate all the work you and your staff have been doing on the Green New Deal. So my question is, in order to meet some of the targets outlined in the Paris Agreement, it's critical that greenhouse gas emitters like China and the US assist smaller countries in developing and financing green projects. So can the US compete with China in financing green projects across the globe? And if so, how?
So Dr. Gallagher?
Yeah, let me tackle that. So first of all, we have a really important new institution in the United States, the Development Finance Corporation. And this institution, together with the Exim Bank, absolutely can be doing so much more. And this was a tool that didn't exist, back in the Obama administration when I was working there. So I think we need to be harnessing the power of this new institution. But that's not our only option. I really do think we need to be looking hard at whether we can have a US-led initiative, or whether we want to partner with China and pool our resources, partner with the EU, bring everyone together around a really giant new low carbon development initiative.
Yep, thank you for that. And Dean Kite, I was just wondering if you at this juncture you have any additional insights that you'd like to add, just so that the audience can have your perspective as this conversation is unfolding.
Well, thank you. I think that if you go back to the wording of the executive order 1 week into President Biden's administration, where one of the, looking at climate at home and abroad, one of the first to-do items handed out to a member of the cabinet was for Janet Yellen. And one of the instructions was that she should ensure that the United States use its full voice and vote in all of the multilateral environment governance mechanisms, the Bretton Woods institutions and beyond to the regional development banks. And so if we think about the capital that is deployed into the international system that is there to help emerging markets, middle income and low income countries with their development, then an alignment between the United States and China and the countries of the European Union and the UK, sending an unequivocal message that this capital should be used to take more risk in order to help these countries be able to prepare their plans and their policies, the kind of work that Dr. Gallagher leads at the Climate Policy Lab here at Fletcher, but then that we find ways to leverage all of our pensions, your pension, my pension, all of this incredible amount of capital that is looking for a return, but is also looking to be invested in a green future. So there is a way to, I think, at scale, be able to leverage private investment into emerging markets. Now, of course, this is something that Senator Kerry, Special Envoy Kerry's team are looking at the moment, but we do have an alignment, and maybe it's too much for China and the US to work together, but having them all aligned that they will only be investing in green infrastructure, but we need to do it quickly and at scale, I think is very important. The investment opportunity for US companies in emerging markets with the know-how of digitalization and hyper efficiency in the built environment, electric vehicles and the technology around smart grids, renewable energy, all of these things, the possible future of a green hydrogen market. These are all export opportunities and opportunities for partnership for US firms as well. So I think that we're beginning to see in the preparation for the G7 a sense of using public money more aggressively to support building back better but green, and then ways in which to leverage private finance into these countries, and to do so quickly, because as Dr. Gallagher said, it's really this decade that we have to make major inroads into emissions, but also build resilience and adaptation capability in countries that are facing the full force of climate impacts already.
Yeah, and the more that we do it, is the lower the cost is for
Absolutely.
deploying the new technology or protecting against the harm that's already built into the system. So it's actually becoming more economical, is it not, Dean Kite, for these international institutions to look at these kind of investments in a way that they probably would have cast an arched eyebrow towards just 10 years ago?
Yes, I mean, framed negatively, the cost of inaction is much, much higher than the cost of action. And this has been understood, I think, by a number of central banks. And it's good to see the Federal Reserve now working with other central banks, including the People's Bank of China, in efforts around how to green the financial system. Put more positively, the IMF has recently published research that shows that the investment in green infrastructure, green investments, as we build back from the economic dislocation of COVID, actually have a much higher multiplier effect into the economy than brown investments. And so we know there's a risk associated with brown. I think we're just about to realize the reward that comes with the investment in green.
No, I think you're right on. I think you're right on. And we don't, as you're saying, the costs of not acting are huge. And it's not just in money that has to be expended to deal with it, but the human suffering which is caused. And the World Health Organization estimates that between 2030 and 2050, an additional 250,000 people every year are expected to die as a result of health damaging impacts of climate change. And further, millions will be displaced directly as a result of the climate crisis. So Dr. Gallagher, following up on Brian's excellent question, could you tell us what are the implications for the developing world, in particular, if the US and China fail to take meaningful action on climate change?
Well, I think the implications are profound because the US and China are the two largest emitters, as you said at the top of our session. So there's no two countries that are more consequential to whether or not we're going to get through this crisis or not. And the developing countries, by and large, are far more vulnerable than the industrialized countries because they don't have as much capacity to be resilient to the changes. Which is not to say that, you know, the United States is weathering the climate crisis and you know, unscathed. Look at all of the wildfires. Look at the hurricane damage that we've had in the United States. But many developing countries are more vulnerable and less resilient to climate change. But I really prefer to frame this around the opportunity because I think the opportunities for U.S. firms and really what we're talking about here is who's going to be able to benefit the most from the economic opportunity related to this transition. Is it going to be Chinese firms who are investing heavily in low carbon technologies and climate resilience technologies and exporting those to global markets? Is it going to be US firms and US workers who are producing those technologies that are going overseas? And what I'd like to see is the development of a really healthy competition because in fact, I think as you said, that can bring down the cost of these technologies, make them more affordable for developing countries, and of course, allow for a much more rapid deployment of these technologies around the world.
Beautiful. So Dr. Lee, can you just lay out so people can get a grasp of this? How does the United States and China currently work together to combat climate crisis through multilateral institutions or bilaterally? Where is that cooperation today?
Mm-hmm. Well, multilateral institutions on a limited scale, I think one of the things we have to pay attention to is that the Chinese state in general seems to prefer bilateral deals, not only with the United States, but also when it comes to the European Union as a whole, or on what China calls the Belt and Road Initiative with all these countries that are in fact receiving a lot of Chinese state capital investments. They're signing bilateral deals behind closed doors, negotiated oftentimes without public knowledge. So I think bilateral negotiations seem to have characterized a lot of Chinese led or China-backed climate partnerships. But in terms of US and China in particular, I think if you scan across the different ministerial level agencies of the Chinese government, each ministry has some sort of agency that's dedicated to international collaboration. And of these offices, each one of them seem to have at least one or two major US-China collaborations. The Ministry of Housing, for example, in China, has an active collaboration on eco-cities. The National Development and Reform Commission has an active collaboration with the US Department of Energy on low carbon cities. So we're seeing a lot of these small pockets of experiments all over China that are utilizing US technologies. In fact, my former employer, Johnson Controls, which is a Milwaukee-based energy company, is very active in this field, and they're continuing to do a lot of that. But I really want to emphasize how, if you look at all these US-China collaborations, at the backbone of these projects, we're seeing not only business collaboration, but also scientific collaboration. What seems to be so pivotal is, for example, when the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab went out to work in a very productive way with Tsinghua University out in Beijing to try and understand energy models that make most sense for Chinese cities. And these scientific collaborations are becoming so hugely important because China, the government, tends to be very technocratic in orientation. So they love to hear scientists. They love to hear from scientific models and how that can predict a better future for China. But at the same time, scientific collaboration is important because that's a good starting point for us to get into data transparency and accountability. And that really is what I think is the most important stepping stone towards a good, transparent governance model, towards equitable, measurable, verifiable governance models to combat the climate challenges that we have.
Thank you so much for that great answer. And again, we have this very tense relationship with China over coronavirus, Hong Kong, South China Sea, other issues as well. But at the same time, we want to pursue cooperative agreements with China on climate change. So I'd like to turn to Chi-Chi, a PhD student at Fletcher, who has a question on this topic. Please, over to you, Chi-Chi.
Thank you, Senator Markey. My question is, are there low-hanging fruits in the near-term U.S.-China climate cooperation that do not require congressional approval, do not touch upon the two countries' areas of competition, but still could potentially make a substantial contribution to the global climate change efforts? Thank you.
That's a great question. And from my perspective, there are several initiatives the United States and China could pursue right now. The United States and China can and should try to negotiate a UN Security Council resolution on the global climate crisis in order to highlight the issue as the international security concern that it is, and shows the world that the United States and China are serious about their attention to climate change. Further, the United States should explore mutual commitments to aggressive emission reductions, development and financing of clean technology, using international aid and mechanisms to help the developing world build resilience and transition to a clean economy. Dr. Lee, how do you think the United States should balance areas of strategic competition with opportunities for cooperation? Thank you, Chi-Chi, for that great question.
Sure, great question indeed. I want to emphasize sort of a number of different things. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that Special Envoy Kerry advanced in Shanghai when he described climate change as, quote unquote, a standalone issue between the United States and China in the context of all these disagreements in the other areas. However, I do want to point out that climate change by definition affects a very wide range of policy areas. If we look at concrete action items under this general rubric of climate change, conservation, for example, it touches on climate change, but also has implications for ethnic minority rights in China. Energy policies, yes, climate change, but also it has implications for intellectual property rights. Hydropower, for example, it has geopolitical implications. Atmospheric engineering, it has territorial implications. Green job development, obviously it affects industrial and trade policies as well. So even though I'm very sympathetic to this desire to pursue climate change as a standalone issue, I think we still ought to be thinking about what Secretary Blinken said in characterizing the US-China relations, where he said, and I quote, this relation needs to be competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be. You know, this layering of agenda items is so important because climate change doesn't fall into any one of these baskets. It falls into all three of these baskets. And we need to be thinking about specific climate change issues that fall into these moments of competitiveness, and others that fall into these moments of collaboration, and others that fall into perhaps an adversarial moment between China and the United States. One of the things which I think is important and is an issue that hasn't been brought up nearly as much as it should, in my opinion, is stability. The Chinese regime is obsessed with stability. They don't want to risk anything that could potentially disrupt a stable way of life in China. And yet climate change is simply going to be the singular most disruptive event in human history. In engaging with Chinese actors, I think there hasn't been enough discussion about how a collaboration is so eminently necessary, because climate change further down the road is going to affect stability. And this regime that's so fixated on stability will need to act, and they need to get all the help they can get because they can't afford to lose it.
I think that was a deep insight that you brought, that it's all three categories, and that if we don't partner, then the consequences are going to be catastrophic. So thank you for that. And so I'd like to give another Fletcher student, Elizabeth Dykstra McCarthy, a chance to ask a question to Dr. Gallagher. Elizabeth.
Thank you for everyone's thoughts today. So I wanted to ask that given China's dominance in the renewable energy supply chain from rare for renewable technology, is this an opportunity or an obstacle for working alongside China?
Okay, I think that question was about rare earths in China and how that could be an opportunity or an obstacle for working with China. So it's an excellent question because China has a very large proportion of rare earth minerals on Earth, and these rare and by most estimates, about a third of the total global reserves of rare earths. And these are used to manufacture a lot of our clean energy technologies. It's important to recognize, though, that China doesn't exclusively have all of the resources. Many other countries have rare earths as well. Vietnam, I think, is the number 2, and the United States, Brazil, and many of our other trading partners have rare earths. So I anticipate that there will be a good global market for rare earth minerals around the world. I think one very important area that needs some work is considering what the environment and social safeguards are around the mining of these rare earth minerals. And it would be great, I think, to work on a global agreement about how to safely mine and produce these rare earth minerals so that we don't create more environmental damage and also put communities at risk as a result of the mining of these types of minerals.
Beautiful. Great answer. And our final question tonight comes from another Fletcher student, Nick Westerfield. For you again, Dr. Gallagher. Nick, would you please ask your question?
Absolutely, Senator Markey. Thank you so much. My question is, we touched a little bit upon the tensions that do exist between the US and China. And so is the US prepared to engage with China on climate, even if dialogue breaks down between the two countries on other fronts? And Dr. Lee, same thing for you. Is China prepared? You were talking about how they prefer these bilateral relationships. Thank you.
Well, Nick, that's a really good question. I thought it was symbolic that former Secretary, now Special Envoy Kerry, he was the first Biden administration official to actually go to China. And it was symbolic that he's in charge of climate diplomacy for the United States now. I think that was a very strong signal that the United States was trying to send to China that we understand how important negotiation on climate is, that it's a very high priority for the Biden administration, and that, even if cooperation, like warm and fuzzy cooperation is hard to achieve in the short term, at the minimum, we need to achieve coordination. We need to be in dialogue. We need to be having these discussions so we can understand what's happening in each country, avoid mistrust from sprouting up, and even conspiracy theories from beginning to flourish. And so I think there's no question that both countries have signaled already that they understand the gravity of the situation, the importance of coordination between the two countries. And I think they're off to a good start by having these early meetings, having Kerry go to Shanghai to have these meetings. I think we're headed in the right direction. And it was probably premature to expect, some breakthrough at their very first face-to-face meeting. But I'm glad that they've started the conversation. I know it won't be easy given all the tensions in the bilateral relationship, but we can't afford not to cooperate with China if we want to solve the climate crisis.
Great. And
if I could just add directly to that, just like the United States can't afford to not collaborate with China, China can't afford to not collaborate with the United States. Now, one of the things in terms of political signals that was very clear a couple of weeks ago was that when Biden called for global leaders to meet at the summit, China could have said no. China could have said that that was a US-led world order that China is actively challenging, but no, they didn't say no. They showed up. It signals that China needs that collaboration with the United States, and in US-China foreign relations, although there are many areas of disagreement, and that's precisely why climate change becomes all the more important, because climate change is the singular last remaining issue, a wedge issue, if you will, that could potentially forge a new collaborative future moving forward. And another issue that we have to bear in mind is how Kerry visited Shanghai out of all the places. And obviously I'm in Shanghai, so I am by no means biased, but the visit to Shanghai was strategically selected in part because you have to remember 50 years ago, Shanghai marked the restart of US-China foreign relations through what at the time was called ping pong diplomacy. It was through a game of ping pong between US and Chinese players that really gave rise to a whole new set of discussions about how the two countries should proceed. And we marked that 50th anniversary of the ping pong diplomacy in Shanghai through a lot more ping pong games between Chinese and American players just a few weeks ago. And Kerry's visit, timed at the 50th anniversary and located in the city of Shanghai, suggests that there is an element of consensus between the two countries, that this wedge issue of climate change is perhaps the ping pong moment of 2021, and nobody can afford to lose it.
that is a great answer. Thank you. And thanks to all the students who asked just fantastically great questions, excellent questions. And we want to thank everyone who tuned in to watch. Dean Kite, do you have anything you'd like to say here at the close of our session? And thank you for hosting us this evening.
Well, no, but thank you. This is a story that will continue to unfold and is a critical relationship at the heart of really a global challenge. And so, there's that phrase that you should always do the best that you can until you can do better. And then when you know how to do better, you should do better. And that's the relationship between both countries. And there will be multiple touch points. How they meet at the Security Council, how they meet at the IMF, how they meet in the multilateral financial system, how they meet in the UN Framework Convention, the Paris Agreement, but also how they meet in governing the deep seabed, and how they will meet in Africa in terms of support on the WHO. In every place where they meet, climate is now everything, as the front page of Time declared 2 weeks ago. And so this relationship is key for all of human progress. And so I hope that we can bring you back to Fletcher to keep on looking at how this relationship matures. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, so much. And thank you for your great leadership in your past and what you're doing right now at the Fletcher School. And just a brief anecdote, after the Waxman-Markey bill passed in 2009, Speaker Pelosi and we went to Beijing to meet with President Hu. And we spent 2 hours with him in May of 2009. Mm-hmm. And he wanted to know what was in the 1,400-page bill. Ultimately, the coal states of the United States were going to kill. And he asked us in detail about what are our plans for wind, for solar, for all electric vehicles. At that point, the Chinese all-electric vehicle was a glorified golf cart. And they wanted to hear, the president of the country wanted to know. And then we spent 2 hours immediately after that with Premier Wen, who was like their domestic planning czar. So they listen to and follow what we do in the United States very carefully. And so, as we know, it can be a competition, it can be a confrontation, or it can be a way in which we come together in order to work to solve all these problems. And I think that this discussion is an important part of a critical conversation that we must have across our country and world about the aggressive, cooperative action needed to address the existential threat of climate change. And I look forward to our continuing to work together to push for big, bold action so that someday children will have to turn to the history books to learn that there ever was such a thing as a climate crisis. That is this generation's responsibility. We thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and have a great night.